bring to you two experts on this topic that will be able to discuss it with you, not only from their national perspective, but their own individual perspective and work. First up, we have Tony Clark, who is a senior advisor at Wilkinson, Barker, and Nauer. And I will let Tony provide any other information you'd like on himself, but mostly get to the meat of the topic here. So, Tony?
Very good. Thanks, Josh. I'm going to beg your indulgence and keep my my video off. I'm not actually having any technical problems, but a little bit of a medical one. I've been battling an eye infection for the last week, and it's really not that big a deal, but I'm afraid everyone will just be staring at my big red puffy swollen eye if I do that. So instead, for the most part, I like meeting folks in person, but every now and then there is an advantage to a virtual meeting, which is you can turn the camera off. But Josh, thanks for the invitation to join you here today. In terms of what I'll talk about today, and a lot of it really does feed into my background, which is, although I'm in the private sector now and do regulatory consulting and expert witness work for clients of our firm, my background for the better part of a couple decades was as a state official, both at the state level in North Dakota, where I was commissioner and chair of the Public Service Commission there, but then for about 4.5 years at FERC, which gave me insight into both the federal side of the equation in terms of energy regulation, but also the state side. And that is, I think, a helpful thing to think about when you think about Order 2222, which is that it does really sit right at the nexus of this whole state federal energy regulatory equation. What I'll talk about in introductory comments is first just a little bit of the history of how we got here to 2222 and what it portends just jurisdictionally and where the arc of regulatory jurisdiction is heading. And then I'll spend just a little bit of time teeing up at a high level some implementation thoughts before turning it over to Ted. And Chairman Thomas has been much more involved in the nitty gritty of actually interacting with the ISOs in terms of implementation itself. So I'll be interested to hear what Chairman Thomas says. So in terms of the arc of what's brought us here to 2222, it's useful to think about FERC's competition policy dating back several decades, and because in some ways this is an extension of where FERC has been heading for some time. Some of the early orders, and those of you who've been involved in the industry are very familiar with them, dealt with areas where FERC had pretty clear exclusive authority and jurisdiction. So the early moves after the Energy Policy Act of '92, like Order 888, open access in the mid-90s, very clearly in FERC's wheelhouse. Later in late 90s, about the turn of the century, Order 2000, which dealt with RTO formation. These were all wholesale market issues very specifically. They would have an impact certainly on states in the retail side, but not a lot of question that it was squarely within FERC's jurisdiction. And there also tended to be in some of these early orders, like with RTO formation, a fair amount of flexibility that was granted to straight states and local utilities. So for example, RTOs yet to this day are not compulsory. They are not mandated, and there's an option for utilities to be members of them or not. There was a turning point, I would argue, about 10 years later, if you get in that 2008, 2009 timeframe, where FERC began spreading its wings a little bit into areas that had both attributes of wholesale power, where FERC has exclusive jurisdiction, but increasingly into the demand and retail side of the equation, where under the division of authority in the Federal Power Act, states have jurisdiction. So you started seeing orders like Order 719, dealing with demand response activities in the RTO and ISO markets. Later, Order 745, which dealt with the compensation mechanism, or what what those DR resources would be compensated in the market. And it was determined to be at full locational marginal price, which from my perspective was not an economic signal, but it is what it is. That led to a really seminal case in this entire area, which is the EPSA decision at the Supreme Court, which dealt with Order 745 and the Commission's FERC's jurisdiction over wholesale market. And what the Supreme Court did there, really in a way for the first time articulated a finding that if a practice affects wholesale rates, then that practice theoretically can fall under some form of FERC jurisdiction. And there's some gray area around what the extent of that is, but the court laying down that marker really expanded the ability for FERC to flex its muscles in this area, because when you come to think about it, there's not a lot that theoretically happens on the retail side that doesn't in some way, quote unquote, affect wholesale rates. But even up until then, what was noteworthy is the Commission, I think, had a fair amount of humility in knowledge that a lot of these decisions implicated things happening on the distribution side of the network and at the retail level. And so the Commission continued to allow the flexibility of an opt-out for states to sort of chart their own course if they thought the costs and benefits weren't there for their citizens. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that these are all directed at the ISO and RTO. And so that's the jurisdictional hook that FERC has been using. Those areas outside of organized wholesale markets, this is less of an issue. Coming out of the 745 experience, then Order 841 on energy storage, which was upheld by, was challenged and upheld by the appeals court. Here for the first time, the Commission went out and gave no opt-out for states. Order 2222 DERS, which we're going to be talking about today, is the furthest extension of that, compelling their participation in the market with no state opt-out, and in a very forceful way. I would argue, and some of the commissioners who've dissented from these have argued along the way, that it, in essence, conscripts parts of the distribution grid for the benefit of the DERS provider. And you'll notice in this most recent FERC meeting now there's an NOI, notice of inquiry out, that would backtrack on the earlier flexibility granted in 719, 740, and 745. Again, compelling demand response participation in the markets so that the states would not have that particular opt-out. So if we step back and we ask, why has FERC engaged in this sort of kind of expansionism in a way that, I mean, it can be easy to think, well, it's just power hungry federal bureaucrats out there, you know, doing this to expand their own authority. But that, I mean, having served there, I don't think it really is that. There is something important that FERC has been trying to accomplish, although have articulated I've disagreed with the way they've gone about implementing it here in recent years. The idea was that FERC wants wholesale power markets to work. And for competitive wholesale power markets to work well, ideally you would have both supply side signals, which FERC always has had, but also demand side signals. In order to get demand side signals, you have to deal with this issue of that veil that exists between the retail side of the market and the wholesale side of the market. And so they're seeking more demand side signals to improve their wholesale market. And the trajectory of these cases then is kind of pushing that line to increase participation in the market from the demand side. And the courts have basically gone along with FERC's ability to do this. So for those folks who have expressed concern about Order 2222, which is the furthest extension of this arc of rules and cases that I've been talking about, the question comes up, well, what's the danger, right? Are the folks who've been raising some red flags about this, are they just sort of, you know, sticks in the mud, state regulators seeking to protect their turf, or IOUs or co-ops or munis who are doing the same, and they, you know, why aren't they with it? And I think the answer is, and I think they're right, what FERC is saying is it's wanting to improve the the functioning of the wholesale market, but they look at these issues through a fairly narrow lens, which is how do you improve the wholesale market? And so the improvement of the wholesale market sometimes comes at the cost of optimizing the wholesale market at the cost of having to put a lot of investments in the distribution side, which is outside of FERC's authority. And in so doing, it may be losing sight of the forest for the trees, which is to say the forest is the end use customer bill. And it really is only the retail regulator, which under our division of powers is the states, that has that responsibility for that end use customer bill. And the trees are the individual components that make up the bill. So it's the wholesale cost, which FERC has authority over. It's the distribution costs, which the states have authority over. It's the transmission costs, which are kind of a little bit of a shared jurisdiction. It's all these things together that equal the end use customer bill. But by focusing solely on optimizing that wholesale market, you may be pushing costs out into other parts of that total bill that may not be in the best interest of consumers in a holistic way. It's a really long way of saying what I thought Commissioner Christie, who is now at FERC, but was a longtime state regulator with the Virginia State Corporation Commission. I'll just read a little bit of his dissent in the order. What he said was, let me be clear, encouraging the development of DERs is a good thing, but eviscerating the state's historic authority in the name of encouraging DER development is not. On the contrary, it's the states and other local authorities that are far better positioned than FERC to manage successfully the development and the deployment of DERs in ways that serve reliability needs, protect consumers from inflated costs that are far more sustainable in the long run. Basically, his concern is that there are billions of dollars in costs that get put into these other buckets, all in the name of enabling DERs. And I think it's a fair point. In terms of just some, now all of that having been said, it's pretty clear the direction of things now. I mean, a lot of that is concerning, I think, in some ways, but it's becoming a little bit of water under the bridge, and that the courts in 841 and 745 have given FERC this authority. FERC recently finalized the rule. And so we're, for better or worse, we're heading in this direction. Candidly, it might make RTO and ISO membership less attractive to some utilities, and certainly in some regions that currently aren't in ISOs and RTOs, but be that as it may, for those that have the obligation, they're in the process now of implementing it. Just a few things stand out in terms of implementation, and this probably goes without saying. It's very technical. It's very difficult. It takes a lot of coordination between the ISO, the relevant retail regulatory authorities, the distribution owning utilities, and it will mean some level of cost and investment in order to make this all work. To get a sense of the level of difficulty, just talk to some of the folks who've been involved in the discussions, or the ISOs and RTOs themselves. I think those of you who keep track of this probably noted that, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago now, FERC extended the amount of time that at least MISO, can't remember if all the RTOs had applied for this at once or whether it was sort of they individually did, but basically pushed out the compliance timeline up to a year in some cases for the time that the ISO has to come back with compliance filing. So this is not going to be easy, and there's a lot of steps involved with it. The key things that I think everyone is especially concerned about, reliability, wants to make sure it gets done, is three big things. Number one, that whatever happens on the distribution side of the grid, and this would include all DERs, including energy storage, is it has to be visible to the grid operator. It has to be predictable for the grid operator, and it has to be in some way controllable. If you lose that visibility, if you lose that predictability or controllability, it has not only market impacts, but it can have impacts on reliability itself. I would just finally say, before turning it over to Chairman Thomas, that I think there'll be some sleeper issues that come out of this. It'll be particularly thorny. And it relates to things like, to what degree do the independent market monitors and FERC's Office of Enforcement have, again, that visibility into what's happening in market operations, and the potential for gaming or other malfeasance in the market. You have to have that visibility into it in terms of ensuring that there are not market power issues that are arising, or other anti-competitive pricing issues that are occurring at the edge of the grid. And if you don't have visibility into that, it can be concerning. This is something that the market monitors have raised from time to time in the case of demand response resources already in the markets that have been operating those for a while, and pushing out and expanding that regime to DERS, which of course is a much broader field. I assume will again be something that the market monitors are going to closely wanting to be make sure they're on top of and watching. With that, I'll turn it over to Chairman Thomas and then look forward to the discussion portion.
Thank you, Tony. It's always good to hear from you. First, I'm Ted Thomas, Chair of the Arkansas Commission. I am pinch hitting today for Commissioner Scott Roop of Missouri. He had a different commitment. Scott and I work on the 2222 compliance task force on SPP, so we're in the weeds on these issues. I view my job primarily as wanting to protect consumers, and there are two big threats that I think about the most. One is the climate threat, and the other is the climate policy cost threat. I think it's a huge risk that nobody is talking about. What if we do all of this stuff that costs money to reduce emissions, and the climate or the temperature just keeps going up, going up, going up, and the only choice is to throw money at it? To me, that is a result that must be avoided at all costs. The ultimate answer to me in dealing with these threats is technology. We don't know which technology, but technology in general. Technology advances in an iterative fashion, but so we don't know who the winners will be over the long term, and those change over the long term. I think markets are very good at sorting out competing technologies. If you think of a family tree, like from genealogy, or a technology tree, you play video games, or a coaching tree, if you're a football fan, you think of a tree, the branches go up. When you look at distributed energy resources, which is any technology that connects to the distribution system, aggregation is a foundational element. It's a branch that's low on the tree such that you cannot aggregate. You're sawing off the branch. And all of those technologies that we now see existing, and all of the iterations and improvements in new technologies that might result, could be taken away. And to me, the optionality among all the technologies is very important in dealing with the cost threat and the climate threat as well. The reason that aggregation is so important, what it is it allows groups of customers the complexity in real-time nature and 24/7 nature of electricity markets. I mean, they're very complex, and if you want individual customers to interact with them, it's difficult because we don't have enough utility nerds running around there. What aggregation allows you to do, it allows a business like Walmart to group its stores, or Kroger, into a large group to interact. It similarly allows individual businesses, like multiple small businesses, to do the same thing. It also applies with residential customers. If you have 2,500 Nest thermostat customers, then they can form together in a group. It allows you to automate and simplify the transactions. And they're too complex, they won't happen by themselves with individual. So for almost any distributed technology, to me, one of the key foundational elements is aggregation. Who can aggregate is also important in those jurisdictions that have the traditional regulated model. Should it be utility only, or should it be third parties? Of course, new technology involves risk because we don't know what people actually want until they experience it. I remember years ago a presentation by somebody that said, why would Apple go into the phone business? Because the phone business had been commoditized. All the consumer cared about was low cost. Of course, that analyst turned out to be wrong. Why entrepreneurs are very important is because they discover demand. And the most famous entrepreneurs are the ones that discovered demand that nobody even thought exists. Entrepreneurs test demand. There are numerous regulatory decisions when cell phones were being developed that said, and phones were traditionally regulated, that denied approval of cost related to cell phones because regulators don't want to fund speculative technology because any risk if the technology doesn't fail falls back on all ratepayers. So when you look at technology, you get the two models. There are pros and cons to both models. I think you get more innovation with third parties, but the utilities have an obligation to serve. The utilities also have more ties to those customers. Your third parties will cherry pick, get the best customers. There are all these different issues that are very complex and also very political, given how legislators operate. But the aggregation, regardless who aggregates, is very important for the technologies. It causes, when you have the third parties and when you have these new participants, it causes parties to have to integrate or communicate with the utility in ways they haven't before. And this is what creates the complexity. It's not one entity managing all these things, it's multiple entities. For example, if you have a solar panel that's putting power to the grid and you have a power outage, the utility trucks roll to fix it. In a world where they're the only one putting power onto the grid, they know what lines are hot and which are not. If you have other resources potentially putting a power onto the grid, you have a safety issue, which is real and legitimate. This is where the complexity comes from, and that's why, to me, the most important part of 2222 is it requires the development of the infrastructure for this communication to take place. That is what's important. It's like laying out a highway system, not entirely knowing what the traffic patterns will be, but knowing if there is no highway system, there will be no traffic at all. And for the distributed energy part of the technology tree, if that goes away, then that takes that whole, all of those options of what might develop out of the technology mix in solving the climate problem and the climate cost problem. Commissioner Christie, who Tony mentioned in dissent, I think he correctly points out that these costs will be borne by the consumer. That's true. At the end of the day, the consumer bears all of these costs. But to me, the cost is worth it because it opens up the technological possibilities that will hopefully avoid even more costly carbon mitigation issues. With respect to jurisdiction, I'm a little bit of an outlier. Though a former Republican legislator and a Republican appointed commissioner from the South, my view on state jurisdiction is a little different. Jurisdiction, of course, the question is who is the decider? Who decides? The question of who decides can itself become a barrier in technology because you get a decision and you fight over whether the decision was lawful or not because of who decided. This is a big problem. FERC, as Tony mentioned, created a demand response problem with an opt-out. The Federal Power Act, passed by Congress in the 30s, gives FERC jurisdiction over any practice affecting wholesale rates. And as Tony referenced in the EPSA case, the United States Supreme Court found that FERC could set a retail rate if that was a practice affecting a wholesale rate. Now, if you care about state jurisdiction, as Tony said, this was an open door to massive federal overreach. But the logic of this court is also important. The court found that every transaction in electricity had to be regulable by someone. And if it was a wholesale market, it clearly wasn't the state. So it had to be the feds. In my view, the primary threat to state jurisdiction is this notion of practice affecting wholesale rates. For example, net metering with storage, you got a battery with your net metering, you might want to sell the battery into the wholesale market while using the net metering to offset your retail rates. Well, some might say this is double counting. That storage is part of your net metering system, all you get your state, you don't get the Fed. Who has jurisdiction over that? Well, if you look at the practice affecting, that's clearly a practice affecting the wholesale rate, and FERC could take jurisdiction over every aspect of DER rate making where you mix state and federal revenue streams. Next, FERC in 841 required RTOs to permit distribution connected storage in electricity markets. They didn't have the opt-out. In the appeal of 841, the DC Circuit Court of Appeal found that no opt-out was required, but also held that a state could condition participation on a retail program on that customer not participating in a wholesale program. In defining where the line was on a practice affecting, the court drew a line that in my view is a more valuable line from a state regulator authority perspective than the value of the opt-out. The state can condition participation on a retail program as saying if you participate in a retail program, you can't participate in a wholesale program. Now, how this would work, particularly when you look at MISO and SPP, we don't have a lot of demand response because the capacity value when you don't have a capacity market is in the IRP process controlled at the state, the resource planning at the state. The state level controls capacity value, which is one of the largest in the value stream for any DER. Since the state controls the capacity value, if you're a market participant, to get that value, you have to participate in the state program. And if the state can say you can't participate in the federal program, this gives the state the trump card on DER jurisdiction, which is why, although, you know, if you ask me in a neutral world, do I prefer an opt-out or not, I'd probably prefer the opt-out. But the court decision that gutted the opt-out, in my view, provided state regulators with something even better. This gives the state jurisdiction over double counting, in my view. It gives the state a trump card to play in as it works with the RTOs to construct a program. Because it's probably a failure on both the state and the federal side. If you had two separate programs, this gives the leverage to the state to get the state program consistent with state preferences on policy. This is similar to transmission planning. In transmission planning, the RTO takes transmission planning, federal, but the state has authority over certification. They can plan all they want. They can't build without the state. So since the state has that authority, the state, we don't have to ever exercise that authority. Everybody knows that we have it when we do transmission planning through the RTO, and you get a reasonable, in my view, balanced approach for that. And let me tell you one more time about how technology can be a barrier. Jurisdiction can be a barrier, and how did the opt-out die? The opt-out died. It starts with a man from Missouri that you're probably familiar with more from his Arkansas connections named Sam Walton. Sam wanted to aggregate his stores, and even though Arkansas had an opt-out, it's been my express preference that we should examine whether we should allow DERs. We don't want to opt out. We want to allow them. So Sam got a third party, his company got a third party to file for approval to do that. So we have one litigated proceeding that they filed. Well, we at the commission made it a second proceeding because I don't want a policy just for Sam. I want a policy for everybody. So now we have two parallel state proceedings, one on Walmart's application, the other on this generally for all customers. Next, what happened is MISO, the RTO, filed a tariff update to help us accommodate all of this. And then they got a protest from a utility. So the utility filed a protest, and now we had two state proceedings and one federal proceeding. Next, the company that wanted to aggregate said, hey, wait a minute, if there's no opt-out on storage, we'll just file our storage and use it as a demand response thing. We'll get interconnected as storage and use it as demand response. So they filed a FERC complaint and said it's logically inconsistent unless you can separate demand response and storage neatly, which you can't do unless you want to take away the flexibility that the technologies provide. Your decision falls upon itself. And at that point, then we have the fifth litigated proceeding when FERC said, okay, now we're going to look at rules of taking the opt-out away. The fact of the matter is our state wasn't trying to opt out. The state opt-out was used as a litigation wedge to prohibit a business transaction that two third parties wanted to make. That's how litigation can kill technology. And that's how the opt-out started to die. And I know it's a different perspective than NARUC. I'm an outlier with my state commission colleagues, but the main point I would make on jurisdiction is when you compare the value of an opt-out, in my view, to the value of controlling the practice affecting monster, like the DC Circuit did in the storage case, I prefer that world than the world where we have an opt-out, but you have this monster of practice affecting still roaming around, trying to devour state jurisdiction. With that, I thank you for your time and would be glad to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ted, so much. Chairman, that was very interesting. I have to admit that the last portion of your session there, the attorney in me, which I don't get to use as much, was geeking out a little bit. So very interesting, great analysis. Thank you. And to make sure, if we can have Tony, if you can hop back on, make sure you're joining us.
Yep, I'm here.
Great. We do have a couple of questions from the audience. One was, can regulated utilities act as DER aggregators themselves? Are they able to do this currently in any state or region?
Yes, but you know what will make them do it faster and better? If you allow third parties to do it too. Our customer that wanted to do DR aggregation went to utilities and can you do this? And they said no. They found a third party that could. And they said, well, yeah, we can do it, but we should be the only ones that do it. That's what started off this ball of litigation where utilities need to do. And it's not just the utilities that inhibit innovation. It's the regulatory model. And me as a regulator, I'm part of that model. It's not a model designed for regulation. It's designed to cost control, and speculative investment can be a cost. I want our utilities to aggregate. I want them to occupy the field before a third party even shows up. They haven't done that yet. I need the third parties to help them move a little faster. That's my perspective on that question.
All right, Tony?
No, I think Ted covered it well. I wouldn't have anything to add.
Okay. As a follow-up, that Chairman, do you think that when you talk about third parties filling the void that the utilities haven't quite covered yet, do you feel that this order is going to help push the utilities into that marketplace?
Yeah, it helps enable the third parties. It helps create the infrastructure. The third parties, I think, are better at testing demand. But if they find demand for a more customer interactive system, the utilities with their vast resources and their knowledge of their system and their customers, I like the third parties hitting the beachhead and the utilities coming in behind them. That's how I think you get a real thorough test of demand, which is what we need. Right now, we have a simple process you use without measuring. You get a bill for it, and you complain about it. This interactive notion is entirely new. We don't know if people want that or not. They might not want it at today's prices, but might want it at a higher price. We just don't know. And who's going to take the risk, the cost risk, to figure out whether they want it or not? That's the ultimate question.
All right. Tony, same thoughts as the chairman?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Ted said. The only thing that I would add to it, and it's I guess implicit in Commissioner Christie's comments that we had that we both referenced during our opening comments, but utilities do have an incentive, not only the one that Ted laid out, but also the opportunity to go before your state commission to make investments in your distribution side to enable these the DERS technologies is an opportunity for utilities to earn a return on investment. And CapEx is the name of the game for utilities themselves. So they may be encouraged to do that. The somewhat difficult position that state commissions are going to be put into, and it's going to be incumbent on them to really tap their expertise, is making sure that they're appropriately vetting the prudency of those investments. In order for DERS to happen, you will have to put a lot of money into the sort of telemetry and visibility and all those things that I had talked about a few moments ago. And it's going to be important that state commissions have the record developed in front of them so that they can make a smart decision on the prudency of those investments.
Great. We have a second question, and I feel that you did address this. It might have been asked prior to you going in to further detail. But they said, can you elaborate on the issue of resource double dipping in retail and wholesale markets and how this might be mitigated? If you feel you've addressed that, that's okay. But I want to make sure.
I touched on it and just touched it. It's probably the most complex issue I've ever seen. FERC had a technical conference on this, and one of the panels was on double dipping, and they had 7 people sitting up there, and they could have been speaking a language I don't speak for all I understood about what they said. And there's some people that accuse me of speaking other languages when I talk about this stuff because it's so complex. There's a level of complexity is almost unimaginable associated with the double counting topic. But to me, the key is you got to get everybody paid once for the value that they provide, but not twice. But when you have market participants that are litigants, when you start mixing in other motives, it becomes very, very complex. But to me, what I like about the DC Circuit Order on storage is it gave the state a trump card in that discussion. Because if the FERC or the courts had declared that as a practice affecting wholesale rates, we would have no jurisdiction. I would have nothing to do. It would all be done at the FERC. But the way they set it up in the MISO and SPP area, we're going to be very involved in that. That's why I don't see the jurisdiction slipping away in this area. I know that you can't say that about all areas, but in this area and in our RTO model, it's different if you have a capacity market.
So as a follow-up to that, whether it's regulatory, it's often in regulatory communities and environments, there's a big issue about uniformity and consistency. When utilities or stakeholders are involved, looking at in Missouri, Ameren as an example, operates over state lines. Evergy in Missouri, Liberty, a lot of utilities are no longer simply bound by the state borders and thus the state regulatory body. And with technologies, whether you look at the Grain Belt Express trying to take Kansas wind all the way to the East Coast, there is somewhat of a case for a larger uniform policy, so when you talk about technology, having one technology and one system in place, allowing people to more cost effectively implement some type of solution. Do you feel that while the Trump card definitely does clear up certain things and keep a regulation within the states for a variety of different things, do you feel there's a risk of slowing adoption and transition due to the fiefdoms that are the states?
So, that's a thread that weaves its way through a lot of FERC and state commission decisions over the years. How much flexibility is granted to the state and how much, and the degree of differentness that is allowed between either the different states, the different utilities, or the different ISOs and RTOs. Maybe I was scarred by the experience in my early years in regulation of having lived through standard market design at FERC, but I came to the conclusion that the variability, the flexibility that's given between certain regions and different states ultimately is generally a good thing. Now, it can reach a point where there has to be some uniformity of a rule, but I think allowing the space for states and regions to figure out solutions that may work for them in a space where, I mean, look, the electric industry is the result of a context that came about because of particular historical circumstances within different regions and very different resource bases. And so I always tended to allow for that level of non-uniformity.
Me, when you look at the markets are going to bring non-uniformity, and you want innovation is by definition non-uniformity. But that's only half the story. Markets are really good at that. But if you need a network, markets aren't so good. A network has to be planned. And networks don't show up at random. And what makes this difficult is it combines the network elements where you want the planning, and it also the market, it combines them. And kind of what we try to do is you think of the internet as the network, and what we want is the technology to be plug and play with respect to the network. And that's easy to say, but it's really hard to do because the lines in reality aren't all that precise.
Well, just one last question here for you. Let me just make sure I didn't miss one. Oh, there was some here I missed. I apologize. To clarify the point about utilities as aggregators and double dipping, for example, a regulated utility in Missouri offers a DR program. Do they currently, or will they down the road, have the option to bid that DER aggregation into the capacity market as well? Or how does or will that work?
That will depend on your IRP rules, and we're working to modify our IRP rules to make it less of a regulator and utility sitting down at the table planning and trying to interject those markets. That has to be done at your state level IRP, or that value isn't captured. That's the number one reason why we don't have a lot of demand response in MISO and SPP as compared to, say, PJM. You get that at the capacity market. Now, that would be the benefit of a capacity market, but the detriments of a capacity market, we'd need the rest of the afternoon to talk about the detriments of a capacity.
The only thing that I would add to that is I appreciate Ted's point. I think it's exactly right, of focusing on the importance of capacity and the increasing importance of capacity values moving forward. I think one of the things that it's widely known, but in some ways underappreciated, how profound the change is going to be in the energy market is the degradation of LMP prices and how they're becoming, in a sense, less important. With the whole LMP pricing regime was set up when almost all resources were dispatchable and had a fuel cost. And that market clearing price had a pretty good rationale in those days. As the markets become flooded with resources that have zero variable cost, it's having a really profound effect on that core central issue that's a component of every RTO, every RTO's energy market. And so it makes capacity that much more important.
And that's probably the biggest, what Tony just referenced, that's the biggest long-term challenge. Of course, as time goes by, it becomes a shorter-term challenge. We have a very good RTO system built on a concept that's being undercut with zero marginal cost resources that are cheap to dispatch, but they might be expensive. At some point, those things have to get together. A windmill made out of gold dispatches in an RTO market at zero because you've already paid for it. There's no fuel cost. And as those resources expand, it really undercuts the foundation of the RTO model in ways it's going to have to change to accommodate that. That's a really complex big picture. And finally, who pays for the litigation? The customer does. Sometimes the customer pays for both. Sam's paying for his lawyer, and Sam gets a bill from Entergy, and he pays their lawyer too. So Shakespeare sometimes has a lawyer. I am a lawyer. Shakespeare had a quote on that sometimes I think has a lot of merit to it.
Well,
as long as they don't start with me.
Chairman Thomas, Tony, thank you both very much for participating in today's session. While very technical, I think it is necessary. It's definitely something we need to keep our eye on. And from everything that goes on at NARUC and the Public Service Commissions, we know it's always on topic. So thank you both very much for participating today.
Thanks so much.
For all of you that's left, this is our last session for today. Would like to, again, thank our sponsors, but also remind you to join us tomorrow at 9 a.m. Where we have another half day of presentations. Specifically, we will be talking about cybersecurity threats to energy infrastructure, smart energy infrastructure, which includes AMIs and alternate artificial intelligence, pardon me. And finally, a very interesting topic to many of us, the February cold weather event and its impact on energy infrastructure, resiliency, reliability. I look forward to talking with you all tomorrow, again, 9 a.m., and have a great rest of your day.